Welcome to SEC Sports Roundtable. This is your host, Shane Bailey, back for day 2. So we had such a long hiatus, and we're getting right back into the swing of things with a back-to-back podcast. Joining me tonight from Bama Hammer is Nick Jones, longtime a friend of the show, and always good to be on here. So, Nick, thanks so much for joining us here.
Yeah, Shane, it's good to be back. And, like we were talking beforehand, I watched a couple of the episodes from last night. And like you said, I think you said this yesterday, it seems like it's just snuck up on us because we haven't done, much preseason talk. But we always know when it comes August and we start doing these previews, doing multiple shows a night, football is just around the corner.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. For those that may be new to the show, it's a podcast for the SEC fan. We are fans ourselves, so we bring a little different take at things, and so we're doing that from a somewhat educated, I won't say fully educated, view of things. But we've been doing this for about 3 years. This is year number 4 for SECSRT, and so I've always had one all the way through, even through the slow times of baseball and the late summer of June and early July, where there's just not a whole lot to talk about. We've been able to fill it with some hot air and dead air at times. But this year we took a hiatus, and I'm glad to be back. It's really exciting to get back into the swing of things, and it's really got me pumped for football more than in the past, because we've always been talking about it. And since I've not had that in the past few months, I had a third baby that joined our family back in mid-March, and so there was a time of adjustment there, and life was just going full speed there for a few months. And so this kind of took a back seat, especially when I was able to get a free moment. I was realizing that there wasn't a whole lot to talk about, so that pushed it back even further. And so we appreciate the fans staying on us and reminding us that we've not done podcasts. So here you go. I think we've got most of our kinks worked out, got the dust kicked off of the last 2 episodes. We did our Alabama and A&M episodes, so we apologize to those fans right now on those. So if there's anything I can do, I'm going to go back and try to make those a little better. We will do that. But Nick's here tonight, and we're gonna cover Florida. And look at we're flipping sides and going back to the east. So we'll do a little east-west kind of thing. I won't guarantee we'll continue that exact pattern, but we will share time on each sides of the SEC and take a look at Florida. And then, you said you listened to the podcast last night, Nick, and the theme on the West is what has all this change brought for them, and what will it bring to them this year? And Florida is actually in that same boat. They're one of the few teams in the East that's had a huge amount of change that they're going to have to adjust with, and that's the firing of Muschamp leaving, and the hiring of Jim McElwain from out west at Colorado State, bringing in a completely different mindset for the state of Florida and Florida Gator fans. They've had that defensive, hard-nosed coach, and now you're going to flip sides after 2 of those coaches and get an offensive-minded coach that's going to run a little bit different type of offense than what the SEC has seen most successful in recent years. They're going to run more of that pro-style offense from all indications. So.
Yeah, and one thing that interests me, and I wouldn't say I'm excited to watch any football game right now, honestly. I mean, me and my dad were watching the Hall of Fame game the other night just for a couple minutes, and just to see him back on the field is great, even though that's NFL. But, Shane, I'm sure you know this, and a lot of our listeners and viewers know this too, but as an Alabama fan, and I'm sure Britton is like this as well, Jim McElwain is very close to my heart. He was with Alabama for several years, took Alabama to the 2009 national championship and was behind that great offense and recruited some of the most well-known guys, especially on that offensive line. You talk about Barrett Jones, Chance Warmack. These are all guys that, of course, Saban went out and got Jim McElwain back in his early days at Alabama. But that system of offense was custom groomed to go with Alabama's defensive play. And, you know, especially last year, we saw Alabama move almost drastically away from that. But by all indications, that's something that Florida fans should be excited about, is that smash mouth type of football. You're going to run the ball first, try to control clock. But on the flip side, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, Jim McElwain he's no Lane Kiffin, and he's no Steve Sarkisian and some of these other guys that are out there that are noted quarterback gurus, and you think about gunslingers. But Jim McElwain developed a third-round pick last year out of a guy that nobody even knew about going into the season. And to say that as well as Greg McElroy, and he had his hand in A.J. McCarron, I mean, these aren't guys that we're talking about lighting up the stat sheet, but they're winning quarterbacks. And although Florida may not have a winning quarterback on this team this year, you've got to be excited for the future. And that's going to be the theme, I think, is this is an extreme rebuilding process. And in my opinion, not to spoil anything, but if he's given the right amount of time, I think he can do some good with it.
Well, and that's a good point. It's will he be given enough time? Because let's face it, some of the things you said about the program and what he can bring to it is great. If Florida can come in and bring smash mouth football, the issue with Florida is, do they have the personnel in place to be able to do that?
Right.
I mean, their quarterback last year that was for most of the season, even though he was not very efficient, is no longer there, right? He went to Louisiana Lafayette. Right, Driscoll, yeah. And he was a senior, so you're looking at senior leadership jumping ship there. And I'm reading and hearing now that there might even be a redshirt sophomore that's going to fit more of McElwain's style. McElwain's style. He's going to have a really good shot of being your quarterback down there in camp right now. It's still a thin program, even though you're able to get all the recruits from the SEC. That's the good thing about it, is it's the state of Florida. It's easy to recruit in your hometown, your backyard. You've got lots of options to choose from. It might not be that 3-year, up here in Tennessee, you're hearing Butch Jones, it's his third year, and there's some backtracking on his part now, trying to calm everyone's nerves, saying that, we might not be where we need to be at this point. And they have a depth issue. I mean, they're very thin. Florida, it's not going to take them 3 years to build up depth. They can rebuild and put in depth because they still have a lot of talent setting there. It was wasted talent in a lot of situations and in a lot of spots on that program. But they have a lot of opportunities to fill some holes quickly. But you got to wonder, can they turn it around in just a year? I have my hesitancies about that. The good news is it's the East. It's still pretty weak in comparison to the other side of the SEC and the other side talent that they bring to the table on Saturday.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is definitely, this would be it's already a monumental task, let's be honest, just with crossover games, having to play the guys in the West. But if you look at Jim McElwain, and he was having to play the Alabamas, the Auburns, I mean, I'm sure y'all talked about this some last night, and this is going to be another theme, but, there's 7 teams in the SEC West that, at the beginning of the year have a very good shot to win. Like we've seen over the offseason, everybody's been saying, there's going to be a $4 million coach who's going to finish last in the SEC West. That's going to happen. It has to happen. But if you want to look at the bright side for Jim McElwain, he has brought in Doug Nussmeier, who, of course, succeeded him in Alabama. And then you've got Jeff Collins, who, was at Mississippi State for so long, had some great defenses there. Last year, a great defense as well. But Shane, we were talking, I specifically remember several podcasts where you, Britton, and I were on there, and we were just waiting for Muschamp to be fired because it was a horrible brand of football last year. I mean, it was terrible. There were some games that, watching Driscoll I think there was multiple games he had under 100 yards passing. They eventually go to Treon Harris. And then when I was, going back and kind of, that's what was, burned in my memory. But when I was going back, a 7-5 year, 4-4 in the SEC, and they end up winning the Birmingham Bowl, which, I mean, isn't a great bowl to go to, but finishing on a winning note. And, we were talking about, what was it, after the first game when they played Idaho, and that game was canceled because of rain, I think, that may come back and hurt them because they only played 11 regular season games instead of 12. And not to say that, I mean, they're really anything from last year has nothing to do with this year because of the changes that they've gone through. But to go back and look at how horrible I thought that season was, granted, I didn't relive it or live through it as a Florida fan, 7-5 seemed way better than what I was watching on television last year.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, and realistically, if they were able to play that game, you're looking at 8 wins potentially.
Yep.
And if that's the case, now you're talking about Muschamp might have been here this year. I know that it was just a game. It was a meaningless game as far as who they would have played. But, now you're talking 8 wins. It would have been a different bowl game too. Situation. It's that situation as well. So lots of crazy things happen with Florida. I'm not excited to see what this brings to the Florida Gators. Me being a fan of a team on the east side, I like them. I like the Swamp being in misery and being in a tailspin. It only strengthens things on my side of the ball. But I don't feel like this is going to be a long rebuilding program. I mean, I'm going to liken this more to what Arkansas is doing in the West. That's year 3 of that program. And there's some folks say that they can compete for an SEC West championship. They're at least in the discussion right now. You're not having that with Tennessee in year 3, and you could very well have that same type of conversation with Florida in year 2, year 3, with the way the East is. I mean, their only real competition right now is Georgia, and so it's easy for a second team to be able to emerge because it only takes that one. I mean, you're talking Florida, Georgia fighting it out. Well, it's the cocktail party.
Yep.
It could go either way at that situation. So there's a lot of positives that Florida can put on their coattails and ride a lot further than other programs that are trying to have to rebuild. I mean, they're even getting $15 million in renovations for their practice facilities because they're saying they're subpar. But, I just remember Urban Meyer's regime and how Florida had some of the best facilities in the SEC. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine that they've fallen that fast as far as facilities go for them to say that they were in dire need of upgrades. But if that's what it takes to get $15 million in upgrades to say it's in dire need, go on and do it, I guess. But it's going to be an exciting year for Florida. I mean, they still have a tough way. You look at their schedule as we look into, trying to figure out where they're going to land. They've got Ole Miss in the West, and that's a home game, but they go to LSU. They still have Florida State on their schedule as a non-conference. You look at it, they're lucky because they're going to get the East opponents. They're going to get a real opportunity with Kentucky, with Vanderbilt for sure. Although their defense is going to be much improved. They do go to South Carolina, and it's at Kentucky. So, the teams at the East that could give them some easy wins, they're on the road for 2 of those. And that's going to make it even more difficult. Commonwealth's coming off of some major renovations, lots of things to be happy about in the Bluegrass State as far as where that program is directed towards, where it's leaning towards. It's not where it wants to be, but it's on the right path. South Carolina, you've got Spurrier salty as ever, and the old ball coach isn't down there making waves like that unless he's got an ace in his pocket. There is something that's exciting him about South Carolina football right now. So if you're wondering about a dark horse in the East, to me that it's South Carolina. It's not Florida because Spurrier's not going to go out and make that kind of noise unless he's got something to back it up, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right. And something, not to rehash too much, but one of the things that really hit me when you were just, talking about it is, Bielema coming from, he runs a very similar system, but, different circumstances, of course. But I think you're right. And to caution Florida fans not to make excuses, anything before Jim McElwain's even coached a game. But I can go ahead and tell you, it's going to take a couple years to rebuild this system, because if you're playing system ball, it's going to take getting the perfect guy at every position, especially offensive line and fullback and running back and tight end. I mean, the skill guys aren't going to matter as much in a pro style offense as they would in a spread type offense. But if you see a spread guy coming in, Florida's got athletes all over the field, even on defense, that could potentially play wide receiver and H-back and things like that. So, but I think you're right. To compare it to Arkansas, it's a really good example, because how many times have we thrown out that stat that Bielema's only won 3 SEC games in the past 3 years or whatever it was, and now he's in contention for the West. Granted, we haven't played a football game yet, but so many people see what he's done on that offensive line, and with the dual threat runners that he has, the 1-2 punch back there, it's scary, and that's all it takes.
Yeah, and we haven't done Arkansas, and I've not researched it enough to talk too much on that program. But you just look at it and go back to last year. What Arkansas had in their favor was you saw improvement on the field, and you saw vast improvements on the field every single game. So while they might have only won 3 games in the SEC, every single time they got on the field, they looked better. And you want to see that out of a program, and you're going to see that. But it was markable improvements that you saw out of Arkansas, that it wasn't just small incremental improvements that you get out of teams from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. There were some huge steps that they were able to take and strides they took improving that program. I think Florida can do some of those similar things. You talk about the quarterbacking position, and I mentioned this. Will Greer is their guy. He's a red shirt. He is that pro style quarterback. I mean, I think he was a top 50 quarterback coming out of high school. I mean, he was highly recruited, highly looked at, lots of stars attached to him. I don't know if there were 4 or 5 behind his name in the recruiting things, but he was a very accomplished pocket quarterback coming out of high school. So he's going to fit McElwain's style much more than Trayon Harris. Not to mention he's probably going to – I'm going out on a limb here, but he's going to be more accurate. I mean, Harris, he was well less than 50% completion ratio last year. I mean, he couldn't hit the barn even with the doors open. So there's some big things. If he is truly what they're looking for in a quarterback, there's a lot to be excited about if you're down in the swamp and you're a Gator fan, because if you have that right quarterback, and if that is their quarterback, well, now all of a sudden you've got some excitement to build off of, because that's exactly what he can do. And you already talked about how he was able to do it in Alabama. He was able to do it at Colorado State. Before that, he was pretty successful at Tennessee as well, was he not?
Yeah, he was. And a lot of people don't talk about those offenses, but he was. So,
I mean, that was during some times for Tennessee where they weren't necessarily national championship contenders, but they had some pretty decent offenses during his reign there at Tennessee with what he was able to do on the offensive side of the ball. So he is definitely – McElwain is somebody that's definitely well-known inside the SEC circles. It's not like even though he was out west at Colorado State, it's not like this is unfamiliar territory for him and what he can do.
Yeah, and before we get on into the schedule and everything else, it's going to sound completely opposite of what we just talked about, establishing the run game and how much the offensive line, how big of a role they play. But and this is completely under Muschamp, but going back to I'm going to refer back to the only time I saw him in person was against Alabama. They didn't look great. That was kind of Lane Kiffin's coming out party, and I think that was the first SEC game last year, if I'm not mistaken. But one of the things that struck me is their underutilization of Demarcus Robinson. There were several games that I was, targeting, because after we saw Kevin White, who became a superstar and eventually a first-round pick to the Bears, tear up Alabama's defense, it was pretty apparent that Alabama was going to have major issues in the secondary, and they still do. That's one of the big factors this year. But I was extremely worried about Demarcus Robinson coming into that game. He's a very different player than Kevin White. He's a lot less physical, but he's got more speed. I think he sits around 6'1" or 6'2", kind of an Amari Cooper kind of guy. And he went cold last year. I mean, he was their red zone threat, throw the ball up to him, but he's more of a deep threat guy. And, it kind of worries me. Either you're going to put Treon Harris back there, you're going to have a first-year quarterback in Will Grier. Can they utilize him? Because I think he's a junior. Not saying he's going to come out, but if, things get tough, he may end up coming out and, take a third or fourth round selection if he had to. But that's going to be the key for me, is not only establishing the run game, but even when A.J. McCarron and Greg McElroy were here, or when they were there at Alabama under Jim McElwain, a lot of people forget, the run when under a McElwain system hinges on those, either tight end, dump passes or whatever. I mean, it's not – Bielema runs the ball a whole lot more downhill and is completely committed to the run, whereas McElwain's nowhere near a West Coast, style offense, but he does rely on these skill positions as well. And Demarcus Robinson, to me, could be the best returning wide receiver in the SEC. So you're going to have to get the ball in his hands.
And I don't think that's going to be a problem. If the quarterback's as good as I'm hearing,
yeah,
from an accuracy standpoint and poise and the other intangibles that you can bring to the table. I mean, you were talking about a letdown towards the latter half of the season. When you're only completing 40% of your passes as a quarterback, it's not all on the wide receivers when that's the situation. If it's all on the receivers, it'd have been one guy that's got some bad numbers. But he spread those incompletions evenly across all the positions. So you're right in the fact that you look at what Florida brings to the table. They're not going to be that pound and grind type of offense, but they are going to have to complement that run game with the pass game. They're going to be more of that pro set, less of that West Coast. And the defensive side of the ball, while they still lost some players, Muschamp didn't leave that situation he left that in pretty good place. I don't think that there's going to be much of a letdown on the defensive side of the ball. And then that can win you some ball games right there. If you have an offense that's capable. I mean, look at Alabama. That's before last year. That was their MO, was it not? I mean, you just have a stifling defense and a capable offense, not just a, light you up, tear you up type of score as many points as you can offense, but a capable quarterback that can manage the game. How many times did you hear game manager talk about an Alabama quarterback? If you can get those capable individuals on the offensive side of the ball and not have that defensive letdown, Florida's got some really good opportunities in front of them.
Yeah, and you talk about that defense. I mean, just pulling up some stats right here. I mean, that's what everybody praises Muschamp for. And like you guys talked about last night, that's why a lot of people think Auburn's going to be so good this year, is because he can instantly transform a defense into something great. I think he's had a top 25 defense for, if not every year, almost every year, even going back to Texas and all of that. But, look at the points against last year, a big time, scoring defense. They only gave up 21 points a game, which is a top 25 defense, a top 20 defense. And that's what gave them 7 wins last year, because as much as they couldn't score, they were still holding the other team to less points. And that's how you win football games, plain and simple. But, they're going to miss some of the guys that they lost in the draft. I'm thinking especially who was it? I forgot his name.
Dante Fowler.
Yeah, Dante Fowler, just a beast up the middle, a guy that's a run stopper, but at the same time, an extreme edge rusher. But, I think that they have the most talented secondary in the SEC. You look at Vernon Hargraves III, a guy that was probably lost, like we were talking about with Demarcus Robinson in last year's, downfall with Muschamp leaving. But, Vernon Hargraves is a lockdown corner, and not to say that those are hard to find, but we've seen less and less of those in the SEC this year. So, if you can keep the other team from scoring, as long as you can score more points than they can,
it's a win.
Yep. I mean, they're going to play some high-powered offenses. You've got to be worried, even though Ole Miss doesn't have a set quarterback yet, even though Missouri has lost some pieces. LSU, we would expect them to be a little bit better than they were last year. So it's going to be tough, but it definitely helps in a rebuilding year that as much as they're going to rebuild the offense, they have that great secondary and that great defense to rely on coming into the next season.
You look at their schedule, and realistically, they could be hosting Ole Miss at 4-0. They start out with New Mexico State and East Carolina. I don't want to give them the win going up to Kentucky, but Florida is like Tennessee. They have Kentucky's number. It's a very, very lopsided affair there. And so it's going to be hard for me to pick Kentucky to pull that one out, even though they took them to the wire, triple overtime or something like that last year with Florida. So they gave them a really good matchup down in Florida. They'll want a little bit of revenge there, but, Florida can squeak away up at Commonwealth, get back to the Swamp to host Tennessee. You're talking week 4 there. Tennessee's struggling with some injuries right now. They're very thin in a lot of positions. So some of those injuries are going to hurt even more because for 2 things. The people that are hurt aren't getting practice time right now, preparing, getting ready for the season. And then you're looking at, you're another injury away from losing that spot altogether. And so there's no real next man up kind of thing right now at Tennessee. So what can happen from the injury side with Tennessee and what they can bring. So you come rolling into Ole Miss potentially at 4-0. Missouri, burn me once, shame on you. Burn me twice, shame on me. I'm not going to give it to them a third time. They just proven that they can put the pieces together, rebuild, and they're for real. And because of that, that's definitely going to be a tough challenge for them because they are going to Missouri and then they are going to Death Valley to play LSU. If they could ever that's a tough stretch right there. That's a 4-game stretch of Ole Miss, Missouri, LSU, and then Georgia.
Yeah, and you look at that. I mean, I'm sure we'll break it down even more, but especially if you're an East team and you've got Ole Miss and LSU, 2 top teams in the West in 3 weeks, that's tough. 2 road games in a row, and just a quick thing that I looked up. But that Georgia game, you might think, well, who's Georgia playing before that game? Well, both teams have a bye going into the the cocktail party, so that's another tough game. And having to play, even though we always talk about, it's not a true neutral site game because they play in Jacksonville every year, and Florida, usually has the upper hand. But I think Georgia, talent-wise, is a much better team than Florida is this year. So,
for sure.
You're right. So, I mean, that's a really tough stretch.
I mean, that's a brutal 4th stretch. And like you said, the bye week nullifies it because they both have one. So they could go from 4-0 to 4-4 in the blink of an eye.
Yep.
Thankfully, they get Vanderbilt after that. Then they get South Carolina. We already talked about that game. Florida Atlantic, that should be a win. And then Florida State. I mean, I'm looking at this and I can see 6-6. I could also see, 9 wins coming out of there, 9-3. But I can look at this and say 6-6 for Florida, and they can be a better. How many times did we say this in the West? They could lose more games and still be a better team than they were last year.
Yep, and you're right. I mean, I've got them at 7-5, 3-5 in the conference. I actually gave them a loss at Commonwealth and a win at home, and a win at home against Tennessee. But those are two games that could either flip flop or they could lose both of them. Just as much as they could be 4-0, like we talked about, they could be 2-2. And how demoralizing is that for a first year coach and a first year staff to do that? One thing that I would say though,
if they go into October 2-2,
it's rough.
That's a whole other ball game that we're going to be talking about Florida. We're not going to be talking about the way we are right now. That's because that 4-game stretch they could then all of a sudden not be bowl eligible. Yeah. I mean, if you go 2-2 to start your season off against that lineup, you're potentially not going bowling.
And look at this. I mean, that's 6 games right there from the start of the SEC schedule into the meat of it. And I'm seeing 1 win. I mean, I don't know what you're seeing, but and I, like I said, I gave them the win at Tennessee. They could just as easily lose that game, at home against Tennessee. Ole Miss to me is a loss. Missouri kind of iffy, but it's on the road. I pencil that in as a loss. LSU on the road is a loss. Georgia is a loss. I mean, not great. Horrible, actually.
That's what's so fun about this. We're sitting here talking up this Florida program, and then we sit here and look at what they've got to go up against and go, you know what? There's not so much to be excited about anymore.
Yep.
And we can do that for almost every SEC team, especially when you talk about the West, how brutal their schedule is. But, you look at the East, and Florida is going to be better, but they're still rebuilding, and they're still facing programs that are rebuilding and have gotten better. I mean, the one biggest question mark as far as rebuilding in the East is still Vanderbilt. What can Mason do there with what he had? They did show some signs of life towards the end of the season. Can they build upon that this year? But South Carolina is probably going to be a pretty good program. We know Georgia has definitely the opportunity to be a great program. They've got a great opportunity, just like they always have. Can they finally get that monkey off their back and finally shake that bug of injuries just at key positions that have hurt them? And if that's the case, Georgia's going to walk away with the East. But it's not an easy way to go for Florida in this lineup and what they have. Kentucky's a better program. They were, while they started out 6-0 or 5-0 and spiraled towards the end and fluttered and barely made it to the finish line, they still are recruiting well. They're still bringing in good talent. There's lots of things in Kentucky to be excited about. I wish I could say it's more promising for Florida than it really might be.
And, it's weird to sit here in 2015 and say that the SEC is harder than it's ever been before when we're coming off a year that an Alabama team that if you would have told me that with a first-year starter in Blake Sims that we would have set a ton of records offensively, had such a bad defensive year, probably one of the worst in a Saban era that people wouldn't consider rebuilding, and then get to the SEC championship, win the SEC championship, and then get to the 14 playoff and still lose out. The first year of the 14 playoff, Alabama laid an egg. Of course, to the eventual national champion. But it's crazy to sit here in 2015 and say that the SEC is better than it was in 2012 when we had an all SEC national championship. But this is what you get with parity. We talk about this all the time. I was listening to a podcast earlier today talking about the Big 12. It's going to be crazy if TCU or Baylor doesn't win the Big 12 because the drop-off is so huge. But that's what's going to be so hard. And I talk about this all the time with people around me that, of course, every SEC school welcomes and prides themselves in the fact that they play in the best conference in the nation. We may not be winning national championships, a 2-year drought now, which seems like forever to SEC fans after winning, 6 straight. But at the same time, other than Vanderbilt And even Kentucky and even this Florida team that we expect to be better, everybody's on the rise. And that's hard to say. After Petrino left Arkansas, there was a couple years there, where they weren't competing. And the crazy thing to say is you can't have a rebuilding year in the SEC anymore. Just ask Kentucky. Just ask Vanderbilt. Because even when you're getting better recruits like Kentucky, bringing in several 4- and 5-star players that they would have never gotten before and that a lower tier SEC school would have never gotten before, the problem is the best teams, the best coaches keep moving forward, and that gap widens. And every time you bring it closer, you're at the same place. You're kind of treading water almost. And that's what we're going to see with Florida this year, in my mind.
Yeah, in the SEC, everybody's gotten better, but Kentucky still, when you look at it, towards the bottom because everybody above them improved too. Right. But if you go put a Kentucky or a Florida and put those guys into a different conference, they're going to flourish because of the talent that they have and what they've been able to do. But the reverse can be said. They wouldn't be getting the talent that they got if they weren't in the SEC. So, that's one reason why they all are doing so much better is because it is the SEC. I mean, look at we never talked over the summer, but look at some of the numbers of what the SEC network did. The number of homes that channel is on. It's mind-blowing what they were able to do and how successful they were able to make that. You're going to look back at Mike Schleif's legacy, and that's really where it's going to be because there's going to be a revenue windfall that this is going to bring to the SEC, and that we've talked about and we all thought it's going to happen, but it's really going to come to fruition, and the SEC is going to continue to improve, and there's going to be other networks out there, and so everybody's going to start to get a piece of this pie. But the SEC was able to figure out how to do it the right way, in such a way to just reap all the benefits.
Yeah, not to get off on a tangent about the SEC network. I wrote an article a couple weeks ago on my personal site kind of talking about this, but the SEC network has been, by many, I've heard this, I've read several TV commentators, this is the greatest, not just sports channel, but cable channel that's been launched in 20 years, ratings-wise, because you look at even ESPN, when it first launched, I mean, it was a fledgling channel because they couldn't get in, they couldn't bust in with the networks. How many years did the networks have, college football games, and how many years did the networks have Sunday or Monday Night Football before ESPN, partnered with ABC and bought it out? And just to think about the revenue share that the teams get from this, I mean, money talks and money wins football games. I don't care what you say. It gives these teams better opportunities like Florida to, even though Florida probably has a top 25 indoor facility and facilities in general, they're probably, if you buy what they're saying, in the lower tier of the SEC, which is crazy to think about, like you said, but that money gives them the opportunity to rebuild and bring in more recruits because it's all just a circle.
Yeah, and it is. And you can take that vicious circle one step further, is that all of a sudden if you start winning games, now your donors, Florida's flush with $1 million donors, you're going to start seeing those guys pile in cash as well. So it's a windfall in every way. And if you're in the SEC, you're like the dealer because you're always going to win. You're always raking this in, and it's I'm glad that this is the group that I've tied myself to and I'm a fan of. I did it because I grew up in SEC country and I've always followed SEC, but I just happened to pick the conference that's doing it the best at this point. And it's going to be cyclical. The SEC is not always going to win national championships. The last couple of years just proven that, and it's might happen again this year because there's going to be so many programs beating up on it to each other that you might get to the end and realize that there's not even a team in the 14 playoff because they beat each other up so bad. But at the end of the day, the SEC is going to win. They're winning the ratings. They're winning the players. They're winning the coaches. They're winning the salaries. They're winning the facilities. I don't know of too many places they're not winning when it comes to that. So,
right. And right before we wrap here, going back to the schedule, something that I didn't point out, I have a tendency, this is how, it's so hard, we always are even worried to even go back and look and see what we predicted. But I think last year, I talked about this at the end of the year last year, that we did a pretty good job predicting. We were some of the only people, maybe it was just by dumb luck, maybe it was by Blair being in our ear all the time, but we were some of the few people in the media, not that we're media members or anything, but people that put their opinions out there.
If you can give me some credentials, I'll take them.
Yeah, there we go. I would too, definitely. But we were one of the only people, groups of people or publications or whatever you want to say, that picked Mississippi State to be as good as they were last year. That there was those mumblings that, well, they could be a 10-win program or whatever. But even though they didn't finish the year great, ranked for 5 straight weeks at number 1. But anyway, another rabbit hole. But one of the things I like to do when we do this is I pick a number and then I work the games out through that number, which is a crazy way to do it, a crazy way to do scheduling. But one of the things that I realized is, coming down to the final game, November 28th against Florida State, I gave Florida a win in that game. And you think about all the things that we talked about, they could go, 1-5 or even 6 straight losses to start out their SEC schedule. What would it be to win that Florida State game at home after they've lost 4 out of 5 before winning, 6 straight? From, I think it was, the Tebow years and Urban Meyer and things like that. And I think it's a real possibility because you look at what Florida State has gone through this year. Obviously, last year they weren't nearly as strong as we thought they were. Jameis Winston, helped them skate through a relatively, easy schedule in the ACC, got them to the playoffs. I mean, they were a good team, don't get me wrong, but I don't think they were a great team. They may not have been playoff worthy, but they won every game, so they deserve to be there. But you look at this year, we saw Sean McGuire come in and almost lose the game for him when Jameis was suspended. And then Dalvin Cook, there's no way of knowing if he's going to be on the field November 28th. Now, he could be, because if he gets a 4-game suspension for the things that he faced this offseason, that could happen. But, by my prediction, I've got them beating Florida State at the end of the year, and a team like Florida State, who's 2 years removed from winning a national championship, only a year removed from being in the college football playoff, and a team like Florida, this has been a relatively square rivalry, but who dominated it in previous years. It would be a big win for them to finish off the season. It's always a big win to beat a rival, but in Jim McElwain's first year to bring back the trophy to Florida would be something special.
Yeah, that could definitely be a way to help mend some wounds that this season might provide for them if they can pull a win off like that. So where do you have them finishing up?
Well, like I said, I have them 7-5, 3-5 in the conference, and looking at the SEC media definitely does not have the best credentials when it comes to picking the place, but you're pretty high on South Carolina, and the SEC media picked Florida to finish 5th in the East, ahead of Kentucky and Vanderbilt. And like I said, I gave them the win. I gave Kentucky the win. So that middle tier of the East is going to be wide open, like I said, or like we've said before. But a 4th to 7th place finish would not surprise me at all. A 7-5, 3-5 mark in the SEC is probably going to put them around 4th or 5th. But we don't know what South Carolina is going to do. We don't know what Kentucky's going to do. I mean, I'm pretty confident they're going to be ahead of Vanderbilt. But so that 4 to 7 range in the East, I think that's where they will be.
Looking at the schedule, I can see 6-6, but I'm gonna side with you. I believe there's one more win there somewhere, and they'll get over that 500 mark and end up somewhere around 7-5. And like you said, I could pick 3 or 4 of those games that could go either way for that win, and they're going to find a way to win one of those. I don't know which one it's going to be, but there's a really good chance that they're going to go bowling again. Some things to look forward for the following season with them. I think that this is a Florida program that when they do go bowling, they're going to be like last year, hungry for a win, no matter what kind of bowl game it is, to build off of and to move momentum forward with that program. So we both got them ending up at 7-5. We've got about 9 more teams. No, 11 more teams to cover and about 2.5 more weeks to do it. We will make that happen. So you guys are going to get your fill of the roundtable over the next 2.5 weeks. But we thank you all for listening. Nick, is there anything you want to finish with any thoughts that you have before we close up shop?
No, you guys did 2 great episodes last night coming back, Auburn and Texas A&M. And like I said, I listened to some of them. Those are 2 big question marks, 2 teams that a lot of people think are going to be improved. So, if you missed those episodes, go back, because I can tell you with 14 episodes coming out in the next, 2 weeks, like you said, or whatever, that's almost an episode a day if you schedule it out. So you're probably going to miss one, but go back, listen to your favorite team first, but then, go back and see how your team stacks up against the rest of the SEC.
I love it. Thanks for the plug. Guys, Nick, people can follow you on Twitter, right?
Yeah, it's that Nick Jones. Like we always say, I do mostly basketball coverage on Bama Hammer, but if you're an Alabama fan, check it out, BamaHammer.com, the fan-sided network of sites. If you are an SEC fan, there's a site for you. Go out there and check it out. Great news source. Find your team, like it up, go follow it.
There we go. Guys, you can follow me just at SECSRT. I'm Shane Bailey. I'm your host for this wild and crazy ride as we go into year 4. We are going to call this podcast done. If I can find the mouse.